Hello and welcome to the Coaching Crowd podcast with me, Jo Wheatley, and my friend and co-host, Zoe Hawkins.
Hi, everybody. Great to be here again this week. And we are bringing you a practical episode this week because we're going to be sharing questions that will help your client to gain new perspectives in a coaching conversation. So we're just going to share with you some questions that come to mind, questions that we know to be useful from the coaching training that we do, questions that are firm favorites with our clients and things that we've seen work well. So if you're driving, you're going to want to have had a pen and paper for this one so you can always catch up again on replay. But yeah, grab yourself a pen and paper or just listen in and let them sink in to your unconscious mind.
So we're going to start off by sharing the question that people that train with us seem to really love, which is, what would you do if you had a magic wand? And I think the reason that they love this is that it's a really liberating question for a coachee. It really kind of frees them from the limiting beliefs that they might have. And they're like, well, if I had a magic wand, then, and your coachee will usually answer with something that they don't think will ever happen in a million years, but it just initially that first bit, and then they will get into if certain barriers were not in the way, then I would do X, Y, and Z. And that's useful in itself because it brings with it that energy of possibility. And then there's a choice to be had between, so do I want to do some work on removing these barriers, the ones that I'm in control of? And that becomes part of our coaching conversation. Or have I just realized that those things that I thought were barriers, really now I said them out loud, aren't really that big a barrier? And it just loosens up what can be quite a fixed mindset that the coachee might be in from having thought about this goal they want to achieve over and over and over and over again in their minds, to then just have the possibility of taking the weight of what they consider to be their reality out of the way.
Yeah, and of course, that sort of leads on to one of the other questions that we had in mind, which is, well, what would you do if you weren't afraid? Because we know fear is an obstacle for many, many people when they're thinking about taking action or they're trying to generate ways of moving forward. Fear is often the number one thing that keeps people stuck in some shape or form. So actually using what is called a presupposition, to offer the client, like, what would you do if you weren't afraid, helps them to step into the zone where they're not afraid and think from that place instead of thinking from the place where they're experiencing that fear and are maybe consumed by that fear. So again, it lifts the client out of their current reality into a different place where they can generate new perspective and ideas from.
And that question is also quite useful, I think, when a client isn't necessarily comfortable about talking about their emotions. So if you ask them a question around how do you feel about your options, which actually is a great question now I come to think of it, but they might, if you ask them the question, what would you do if you didn't have fear around this, enables you then to move into the space of, so what is it that you are frightened of? Because by answering the question, what are you afraid of? Like, what would you do if you weren't afraid? They are accepting that there is fear present as they think about the options in terms of moving forward. So that one has a number of purposes behind it. And it's also important to say, I think, with all of these questions, in their own right, they may be unlocking as individual questions or as a group of questions, but the skill is in when to use them and also how you introduce these questions. That is really a critical part of the effectiveness of these questions.
And following on from that, a really simple question that's often overlooked is, well, what would you like instead? So you've been discussing perhaps a challenge or, something that is in the way for the client in being able to achieve their outcome, and just simply ask them to step into, so what would you like instead? Oh, I don't know. I'm not sure. Or they might be able to tell you really clearly. And again, the answer to that question helps you to know where you might continue the coaching. It might be about helping the client get clarity around what that future state looks like or feels like or sounds like. Or it might be then going into the coach, say, okay, so now that you know what you'd like instead, what's in the way? What's the obstacle for you? Because they might think that the original problem was actually the obstacle. But that's often just the starting point. You're looking at, what is in between their present state and their future state is where the coaching really starts to happen.
Yeah, or sometimes we just say, so how are you going to get it? And asking the question from that mindset of, we believe that you can get it. We believe there isn't, there aren't things in the way of that. But also in terms of what would you like instead, I think sometimes the client can use that question as an opportunity to share what they feel quite shameful about and perhaps haven't shared with somebody else. So they might instinctively respond to that question and say, well, I'd like her to leave the organization. That's what I'd actually like instead. And then you hold that bit of space as the coach for the coachee to really notice what they've just said. But so that space in a non-judgmental way, and then just check in. Is that really what you want? And then they might say, no, it's not really what I want. Well, it sort of is, but it's not. No, it's not what I want. What I want is, and then to move into the other space. But what they need in order to be able to generate options is to be able to get rid of that big block of guilt and shame that they had about that kind of more radical thing that they wanted to have happen. Because I think sometimes when people feel so stuck, a lot of energy is used up going to like the opposite extreme of radical behavior, when what they really are seeking is something that they believe is pragmatic, practical, and is achievable for them. So it's important for us to acknowledge that and facilitate that space in these conversations.
Yeah, that's polarized thinking, isn't it? And you see that a lot when clients are stuck, is they go from one end of a continuum to another, and helping them to explore the spaces in between is something that we would do when generating new perspectives. So another question that is often useful is to tap into the concept of the future self. So this version of yourself who's already achieved what you have set out to do, the version that's gone through all of the obstacles and got all the learnings that they need to be able to achieve their outcome, and ask the question, so what advice or guidance might your future self offer you about this challenge that you're facing right now, or some version of that question?
Yeah, and that can be a really powerful question, because it requires the coachee, or invites the coachee, to really step out into the future, to a place where they have achieved their goals. So it's a really effective way of engaging with the unconscious mind that finds it difficult to differentiate between what has and hasn't happened. So it's kind of planting that seed that it is possible for them to achieve their goal. And in that vein, really, is a question of, what if you already had the answer? That's a really confusing question for people, in the sense of, it kind of requires the conscious and the unconscious mind to clash together, and it's an invitation, really, I think, for the coachee to say anything that they haven't yet said, that they would like to be able to share.
Yeah, and often you'll have clients who won't know how to answer these questions. So the future self one, it might be like, I don't know, I'm not there yet, I'm not sure, I can't actually see it happening. And that will give you an indication that there's more work to be done to help the client to envisage themselves achieving it. Because if you can't see yourself achieving it, there's not really much point in exploring the options, because you don't have the commitment to the outcome there from the client. And the same with that one there. What if you already had the answer? If the client doesn't believe that the answers and resources are within them, then it's going to be very hard for them to answer that question. So the way that clients answer these questions give you more content and direction for where you might take your coaching conversation. And one of the questions I like is, who do you need to be, in order to resolve this challenge that you're facing? Because sometimes it is about what they need to do, an action that they need to take, but sometimes it's a shift in identity or a shift in perspective and being able to see things differently. So they might say to that, actually, I need to be more courageous. And actually, I just need to do it. And I just need to be courageous in my approach to that. Or they might say, actually, I need to be compassionate. I need to be my compassionate self. Perhaps it's a difficult or challenging conversation that they are avoiding. And actually, if they approach that with kindness for themselves and kindness to the other person, then that will make it easier for them to be able to do that. So it's not just tapping into what, it's tapping into kind of how somebody might need to be in order to achieve a certain goal or to gain new perspectives.
Yeah, and they might say, I will be the entrepreneurial me, or I'll be the CEO me. There's lots of versions of that, and that can be very empowering for the individual. And I think there's a question there as well around compassion. So, um, what options would your compassionate self like to bring into the conversation? And that's where we might enable the individual to step out of sort of that driver behavior. Maybe there's a lot of people around them that, see the individual as, really talented and needed to move forward and achieve and achieve and achieve. And actually that compassionate version of them saying might be to say, I think one of the options is that I tell them I'm withdrawing from this project, or a flavor of that. And then you can explore with the individual, what did you notice as you shared your answer to that question? And they might say, do you know what? I felt a real sense of peace and calm. And then you explore it, is that how you want to feel? And then with all of these answers, what you're doing really is generating like a whole selection, smorgasbord of options. And that's really powerful, because we are perhaps meeting the coachee with a fixed mindset. They can only see one possibility, or they can see no possibilities. And then all of a sudden they see a range of possibilities. Now, sometimes the individual is already going to come to the coaching conversation with 101 different options. And their struggle is, how do I choose which option to move forward with, that I want to take action with?
Yeah, and actually on that one, this question would work well with that, and in other situations as well. It's like, how can you honor your values here? Often people get stuck when they aren't necessarily spending time honoring their needs, or they're confused. Like you said, Joe, there's multiple routes forward, but they perhaps become disconnected with what they specifically need in order to do. Perhaps they're over indexing on what other people want from them or need from them. So when you ask a question around, well, how could you honor your values here? It takes them back to core, it takes them back to self, to be like, actually, what this is about for me is my need for freedom, or my need for learning. And so therefore what I need is to be able to X, Y, and Z. Sometimes it's actually the options that we need to take forward are really simple. We've just become disconnected and we can't access them. So questions like that really take the client back to, the center of coaching, which is themselves.
So if we consider other options then for helping clients to gain new perspectives, what comes to mind?
Yeah, I think there's one activity that comes to mind, which I think we picked up in my NLP training, which is a specific activity where you have physical chairs. Now, sometimes coaching these days isn't actually physical and it's done in the virtual space. But let's imagine that you are having a challenge in a relationship. Let's say it's with your senior leader, and you can see your own perspective, but you cannot see the other person's perspective. So they would step into the other person's chair and they would say, I am noticing that I am feeling frustrated, and I'm feeling frustrated because. So they're talking from the first person as they are experiencing this perspective of the other person. So that's the one chair. And then with this other chair, or this other perspective, that's more of the helicopter view. So they're able to take that third chair and look at what is happening between, say, you and I. So from that new perspective, they'd be able to look down and say, what I'm noticing is that both parties here have a valid opinion, for example, and that both parties have some tension. And I can see that is blah, blah, blah. So you're exploring different perspectives. And that can be a really powerful way, again, to literally take the client out of themselves into the perspective of the other person and into that sort of meta perspective. And then as the coach, you can debrief that after you've done that exploration and ask, well, what new learning, wisdom, guidance has emerged from that activity? And how might you use that to resolve your challenge now? So I think little things like that you can embed into a coaching conversation very easily, and are really helpful for clients in being able to gain, new perspective and different ways of seeing things.
There's another NLP technique called perceptual positions, which is like an extension of that as well, isn't it? So you have 9 different positions in that exercise. So you have past, present, and future. So for each of those three, you'd have friend, hero, and mentor. So you'd have past friend, past hero, past mentor, present hero, friend, and mentor, and future hero, friend, and mentor. And you can ask questions around those, but how you do it physically is you'd have you in the center, you'd have each of those 9 positions labeled out onto the floor, and you would say from the you, I would like help and support with how to approach X situation or X person, relationship, whatever the challenge is. And then you would take turns stepping out to who you want to hear from. So you might step out into a future friend. And who is that future friend? That's liberating, because you might say, well, my future friend is Richard Branson, or my future friend is David Attenborough, or Nelson Mandela, whoever you would choose to be, but it's without needing to have logic or reason behind any of those. And you ask for the wisdom and guidance that's available from there. So they answer from that position, and they step back into the middle, and they thank them for that feedback, and they proceed with it, and then we do the reflections. But the purpose of that is, the reality is that those voices, that advice and wisdom, obviously in reality has actually come from the individual. And so at the end of that is the realization that those are all answers and wisdom and advice and guidance and compassion that exist within me and have always existed within me. And that exercise is really just a funnel to be able to enable the individual to, as you said, Zoe, to fully connect with all of the parts of themselves.
Yeah. And so we've given you a number of different ideas and approaches. And coaching isn't always about having a question bank and a tool bank. It's about working from a place of intuition and really listening to what the client needs. And from that, the questions emerge, so where you are fully connected to your client, fully invested in their journey, in full belief that they are resourceful and whole and able to achieve whatever they want to achieve, the questions will come. But as we promised you to give you some set questions today, we hope that those questions have given you some sources of inspiration in how you might help your clients, or just people in your organization, peers, direct reports, friends, whenever you're in conversations with people who are feeling a bit stuck, how you can help them to generate some new perspectives.
I think that blend of the types of questions that we've kind of shared with you there, that are out of context but related to generating options, that blend of those types of objective questions, along with what we might call clean language questions, which are taking the language that your client uses, is a great balance. So for example, if somebody said, what's getting in the way of me coming up with options is I just feel there's loads of noise around this. What options would become available to you if you turn the volume down? So you're relating your question specifically to what the client has said. So whilst I wasn't using the exact language in that example, it was stepping into their view and their lens of the world. So having that blend is really important. So, but that's something that you can practice. If you're listening in, maybe you're already a trained coach, maybe you're thinking about training to be a coach. Hopefully it's given you some stimulation for questions. You probably come up with a whole load of your own while you've been listening to that as well. And that's where it's great to have a supervisor or peers that are coaches, or just peers that can support you to generate your own options when you're thinking about how you can best support other people. So if you are interested in learning more, you might want to check out our book, Deciding to Coach, which is available on Amazon or also on our website, igcompany.co.uk.
Actually, there's also another resource which we don't share as often. We've got a download of 70 questions. So actually, if you're keen to get your hands on a question bank, you can head over to igcompany.co.uk/grow, where we have 70 questions that are all matched to the different phases of the GROW model, which is John Whitmore's coaching model. And you can take a look at those questions to add to your question bank as well.